They were actively acknowledging like, hey, all of this is like all of the aesthetic here is created by gay men, and yet for whatever reason it doesn't seem to be a problem to straight men to buy these products. And the one note that I wanted to make on that that I thought should be acknowledged is that I think that we as a society, I don't think that we have a problem with homoeroticism per se. I think that we have a problem with, and I think that this kind of pointed it out to me at least. We have a problem with men being effeminate, quote unquote effeminate. We have a problem with feminine men. We don't have. It's weird that straight men can completely overlook homoeroticism as long as it's two masculine men interacting with each other, and um that's largely what the aesthetic of Abercrombie and Fitch was. A lot of the beginning of the documentary was discussing how the brand started to kind of get its aesthetic, which actually I found very informative and I thought was actually really cool. So they were talking about how, I mean, I guess Mike Jefferies just had a very specific vision of what he wanted for these stores, which I think is important, to make yourself stand out as a brand. So I mean, even when we start to get into all of this scandal and stuff that they were doing, all of the mess, what actually is kind of like disheartening to me is that I feel like they did a really good job around branding, and aesthetic. And I think that there's lessons to be learned there from branding and aesthetic and being very hyper focused on how you would like to present yourself, that kind of a thing. Imagine that exact same aesthetic if it was including black and brown people, right? If it was including black people and Asian people and Latina people, like imagine um if they had started there. I feel like the brand would be in a totally different place now. Yeah. Gotten a lot more like confidence with this now, right? Using a bar style table as a short person. I don't know, man. Cool, 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 cool. What's good, y'all? What's good, y'all? My name is Morgan Clement. I'm an artist and designer based in Los Angeles, California. I have a clothing line called Matin and Morgan, which is in the works. And this is Good Morning Morgan. And today I am drinking Don Carvajal again. Still working through those grounds. For those of you who did not watch, like a couple of episodes ago, I mentioned that I was getting ready to buy a new brand that I've not tried yet called Everybody's Busy. That is out of Chicago. So, like I said in that video, I will let you guys know when I go about like purchasing it, so that if y'all are interested in trying that coffee around the same time that I do and like hearing my opinion on it and like knowing what I'm talking about, keep an eye out for that. I'll give you guys an update on that. So yeah. Today I wanted to talk about the documentary series, or I guess it's not a series. I wanted to talk about the documentary about Abercrombie and Fitch that Netflix just put up, called White Hot: The Rise and Fall of Abercrombie and Fitch. It seems like there's been like an increase in like business documentary, like not quite business, like business scandal documentaries here recently. Like the Lulu Rich, I don't know if y'all have seen that, like the Lulu Rich documentary series, and the one about WeWork, and the one about Fyre Fest, the multiple ones about Fyre Festival, and the mismanagement of that whole event. And this kind of falls in line with that. And I just have to say that I love this genre of nonfiction documentary, you know what I'm saying? I don't know why I enjoy this kind of mess so much. But it's just, I don't know. I don't even know what you would call this as a subgenre of documentaries, right? But I don't know. Netflix is, you know what I'm saying, kind of getting a little sketch, a little shaky with their content here recently, but I think that they, you know, knew what they were kind of doing with this kind of subject matter, that we're all out here really enjoying these messy business documentary series, movies, you know, those kinds of things. And so I'm assuming that that's why this is coming up. So just as some background, I was not an Abercrombie kid, or I didn't grow up not listening. I didn't grow up wearing Abercrombie and Fitch. I don't think I've ever worn Abercrombie and Fitch, to put that out there. I don't even think I knew what Abercrombie and Fitch was for the longest time. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio, I feel like there are a lot of people who don't understand what goes on in the Midwest. I feel like the Midwest, to anybody who's not from the Midwest, like technically I'm not from the Midwest. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, but I was raised in Cleveland. Don't ask me anything about Atlanta. I can't answer any questions about Atlanta. I don't know restaurants in Atlanta. I don't know how to get around Atlanta. Don't ask me questions about Atlanta. I don't know. I was raised in Cleveland, Ohio. And I think that a lot of people are confused by the Midwest. I think that people think that the Midwest is just cornfields, which valid. You know what I'm saying? The Midwest is, I mean, there's a lot of corn. Admittedly, the majority of the Midwest is corn. I can't, you know what I'm saying? Y'all aren't wrong in that regard, but there's a lot of other things going on. There's a lot of major cities. I think that the part that upsets me when people refer to the Midwest is that they think of like white people living in cornfields making ambrosia salad, and that's what they think of. But there's like a lot of major cities throughout the Midwest where a lot of black people live, and they like largely get overlooked because they're not part of the coastal or the South. So it's like Um, don't forget that, you know what I'm saying, we're not, you know what I'm saying, just because we in the Midwest don't mean we doing white Midwestern things. You know what I'm saying? Don't don't lump us in with that. You know what I'm saying? Don't lump us in with the putting 7,000 gallons of ranch on every single morsel of food that we eat. You know what I'm saying? Ranch is okay, it's decent in the right circumstances, but you know what I'm saying? There's a totally different culture going on in black Midwestern culture. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, so I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And the reason why I brought up all of that is because Cleveland, Ohio is a predominantly black city. I think it's just over. It's like it's not like far over 50%, but I think it's just over 50% black. Highly segregated. Um, I grew up in a predominantly like if you're from Cleveland, you know that the eastern part of Cleveland is where all the black folks are for the most part. Um, and I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood. And so this is relevant because the malls that we had in our neighborhood did not have Abercrombie and Fitch. So let's start there. Let's start with the fact that the malls that we frequently went to did not have Abercrombie and Fitch. Now, the way that malls are kind of like the way that people interact with the local malls in my old neighborhood have kind of changed. People leave our neighborhood to go to the mall now. So the malls in our neighborhood shut down. For the most part, they're kind of like ghost towns at this point. And so they leave our neighborhood to go to a much nicer mall that's in a white neighborhood that I believe does have an Abercrombie and Fitch. But all of that transition happened kind of as I was a little bit older, so I wasn't part of that kind of a wave. So I didn't come into contact with Abercrombie and Fitch until I was in college. There were a lot of things that I was made aware of when I got to college. Like I said, I went to a predominantly black high school, and I didn't realize that for a lot of black kids, particularly in college, you'll run into a lot of black kids who did not have that experience, who did not go to a predominantly black high school, who went to a predominantly white high school. And this was my first instance. Going to college was my first instance of being around people who had not been born and raised in a predominantly black neighborhood, right? Like I was born in Atlanta. We all know we all know what's going down in Atlanta, and I was raised in Cleveland, which is predominantly black. So I had never had that experience of being the only black kid in a white school and thus being forced to kind of accept what their standards of what was cool and what was not cool. I had no experience of that. For me, everything that black people thought was cool was what was actually cool. So when I got to college, it was like this thing of like, it was almost like, well, what? You don't know this? It was like that about a lot of things. You don't know this about, Abercrombie and Fitch. You don't know this about, whatever other kind of brand. And I'm like, no, I don't know any about I don't know nothing about this. Like, what are you talking about? Evidently there was a lot of prestige around Abercrombie and Fitch. I was unaware of that. Like I said, I didn't wear Abercrombie and Fitch. I don't think I've ever worn Abercrombie and Fitch. If I look hard, I think I might have an Aeropostale shirt that I got on clearance at some point. But what I will say is that there was a point in time when I was in high school. I remember that kind of in that same kind of genre, that same sect, American Eagle was really starting to hit their stride when I was in high school. And they had us out here paying for overpriced jeans that had like no yos in them and like no stretch. The thinnest denim that you've ever come into contact with, but they want you to like pay, you know what I'm saying, $60 per jean or per pair of pants or whatever. I don't know. That was a thing, but not with Abercrombie and Fitch. And so when I got to college, I think my roommates knew about Abercrombie and Fitch. They had both, because I had two roommates. They had both gone to predominantly white high schools. And so they obviously knew about Abercrombie and Fitch and the history of that and the prestige or the reputation around it and all that stuff. But we had a friend of ours that lived in a dorm like down the hall that we hung out with a lot. And she actually ended up getting a job at Abercrombie and Fitch. I don't know if it was our freshman or sophomore year. I can't remember. And that was actually my first time going physically into an Abercrombie and Fitch store. So think of me not having any kind of context for it until about like 19 years old. And that's kind of when I was made aware of like the culture around Abercrombie and Fitch, because we would go and visit her at the store. That they like have their perfumes and things, and they put shutters on the windows, and they've got all these gigantic printout photos of like half naked dudes, and you know what I'm saying? It was very white. I think that any black person that has spent time in, or that was raised in a predominantly black neighborhood, that went to a predominantly black high school, probably that's the first thing that you're going to notice is it's very, very, very white. And so, and not only that, but like, I think that there's a specific thing about high school because of the way that your brain is kind of forming, that high school is very much about trying to belong. But by the time you hit college, you're kind of like over that. And so, any kind of like, how do you not know about Abercrombie and Fitch? How do you not care about any of this? Any of that peer pressure is kind of like, I was immune to it by that point. I was like, I don't care about it. It's expensive and it's basic and it's white. I don't know. So yeah, when it comes to this documentary though, so it actually kind of informed me of a lot of stuff because I didn't realize that Abercrombie and Fitch had been as popular as it was for as long as it was. So this documentary made me aware of the fact that when I finally came to the brand, when I finally figured out what was going on with the brand, they were kind of like over the hump by that point. They had already had their peak years, and had already kind of been a staple for probably about like nearly 20 years, or well, actually no, I guess it would be a little bit over 20 years at that point. And so I didn't know that like all of the stuff that I was noticing in being in their stores and seeing like I remember actually having a conversation with my roommates and our friend from down the hall about how they have like discriminatory hiring practices and how they call all of the people on the floor like models or whatever, and how they're just a tiny bit racist and those kinds of things. Like they had that conversation, or we kind of had that conversation at that time. And I didn't know that that was something that had already, like all of the stigma around that had already kind of taken place by the time I was getting to this point. So when I saw that this documentary was up, I was like, that's got to be what this is about, right? Like it's got to be about their history of racism and discrimination and hiring practices and being very, very white, so incredibly white. And so I was like, all right, I'll watch it. Not only that, because it kind of has to do with like branding and like fashion kind of. And so I was like, hey, you know, so you can learn some stuff. You're trying to do stuff with the brand. So, started off on a, obviously they started off with, how the brand was built. The actual brand itself was founded in 1892. It was acquired by Les Wexner, who is known for owning the Limited Brands, or the family of brands, in 1988. They made Mike Jefferies, who is known for creating the brand that we understand it as we understand it today. They hired Mike Jefferies to be CEO in 1992, and the company went public in 1996. So all of this happened long before, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I was barely alive. We'll just say that. And so, a lot of the beginning of the documentary was discussing how the brand started to kind of get its aesthetic, which actually I found very informative and I thought was actually really cool. So they were talking about how, I mean, I guess Mike Jefferies just had a very specific vision of what he wanted for these stores, which I think is important, to make yourself stand out as a brand. So, I mean, even when we start to get into all of this scandal and stuff that they were doing, all of the mess. What actually is kind of like disheartening to me is that I feel like they did a really really good job around branding and aesthetic. And I think that there's lessons to be learned there from branding and aesthetic and being very hyper focused on how you would like to present yourself, that kind of a thing. But once you start getting into the discriminatory pieces, or you know what I'm saying, like the fat phobia, the general xenophobia, for the racism, those kinds of things, that's, I think, obviously that's where they kind of fell out. So let's see. One thing that I thought was really interesting about and they discussed this in the documentary, is that they were like overly focused. They were so focused with aesthetic that they didn't really care about whether or not their employees were good employees or whether or not they had a great customer service skills or anything like that. And they were really really concerned with recruiting, like going out into the streets and finding attractive people or popular kids and making them offers to work for the store so that they can have the most popular and attractive kids working for them and wearing their brand, which, I mean, admittedly is it's a great marketing strategy. It just is. It just is a great marketing strategy. Someone in the documentary referred to it as influencer marketing before that was even a thing, like influencer culture before it was even a thing. And that's true. And let's see, there's a few quotes that I wanted to pull out. I don't know that they necessarily have to go in any specific order, but I just wanted to make note of them. One is, the clothes themselves were nothing special, but it was the label on the clothes and the Abercrombie across your chest that was almost like a badge of distinction. And that was said by Alan Caro, I think is how you pronounce it, the fashion marketing and advertising exec. And then another quote is, just aspirational, the brand was just aspirational enough, but not so expensive that it was out of reach. The fundamental idea is that fashion is selling us belonging, confidence, cool, sex appeal. In many ways, the very last thing it's selling is actually garments. And this is Robin, I think is Givon or Givon or Given. I can't imagine it's Robin Given, because that would be too close, right? I don't know. But she's a senior critic at large at Washington Post, and the same woman. So the same woman said, fashion is an industry that is notorious for not doing market research. The goal is not to give people what they're asking for, but to make them ask for what you're offering. Which I thought was a great point. And actually, one thing that I wanted to say as an aside is that in watching this, obviously I'm coming to this and I'm like, I know that this is a racist company. Like, I know that they have discriminatory hiring practices, but it was surprising to me in watching it. My initial response was like, why are there so many people of color giving interviews for this, right? Like, I was confused. It made sense by the end, but I was like, there's a lot of, like, you know what I'm saying? They got a lot of black women here, you know what I'm saying? They've got a lot of Asian people. Like, what? Like, I know that these people weren't working there, right? Like, I was confused at first, but I want to make a note that Robin, I do not know how to pronounce her last name, so I apologize. Robin Givon, Robin Given. I don't know how to pronounce it. But I don't know, something about the air of knowledge and I don't know. She gave off vibes, and I was like, this is somebody that I want to hear more from. So if anything out of the entire documentary, I was just like, oh my goodness, black fashion critics, I love it. That's what I took away from this, mostly. So yeah, I think that some of the notable things that in the branding part, because we can get to the scandal part, but I think some of the notable things in the branding part that I thought were interesting was there was a lot of talk about how the marketing team was almost exclusively comprised of, or at least the leads in the marketing team were almost exclusively comprised of gay men, white gay men for the most part. And even the photography was done by a man named Bruce Weber, and he's known for creating the aesthetic of the brand itself, taking all of those pictures that are shown all over the store and on the packaging and the bags and those kinds of things. um and one thing that I thought was really interesting about that is that they were actively acknowledging, like, hey, all of this is like all of the aesthetic here is created by gay men, and yet for whatever reason it doesn't seem to be a problem to straight men to buy these products. And the one note that I wanted to make on that I thought should be acknowledged is that I think that we as a society, I don't think that we have a problem with homoeroticism per se. I think that we have a problem with, and I think that this kind of pointed it out to me at least. We have a problem with men being effeminate, quote unquote effeminate. We have a problem with feminine men. We don't have. It's weird that straight men can completely overlook homoeroticism as long as it's two masculine men interacting with each other, and um, that's largely what the aesthetic of Abercrombie and Fitch was two masculine presenting men interacting with this, like standard, you know what I'm saying, cis het men interacting with each other. Obviously the art direction was done by gay men, but I think that it says less about I think that it says less about straight men's willingness to overlook gayness and more about straight men's problem with femininity coming from men. I think that is the point that they kind of missed, that I saw as glaringly obvious in this. They even brought in, not only was there the photographer, um, not only was there the photographer Bruce Weber, but they brought in a mural artist named, hold on a second, Mark Beard, who goes by Bruce Sargent, to paint these murals within their stores. And I think that, and they mentioned that there was a lot of connection between the imagery that they were creating in like classical, like Greek and Roman sculpture and those kinds of things, glorifying the male body, those kinds of things. I don't think that people have problems with two men who are masculine presenting doing nearly anything as long as they're masculine present. I feel like people can and do willfully overlook a lot of gay stuff, just because it's not, if there's no femininity perceived in it, they don't have as much of a problem with it. So I just wanted to make a note of that. And then the other thing too is that it calls into question if they were being as, for the time, they were being revolutionary. I'll say that. I don't want to take any strides away from people who were doing things in the like 90s and early 2000s. I don't want to take that stance of somebody in 2022 looking back and saying that they could have done more. But from my perspective now, it feels like if they were saying it as though they were paying homage to or giving validation to young gay men. And I mean, yes, yeah, but in a very masculine sense. And I think that that's still in a way, to me, kind of playing into being acceptable, like respectability kind of a thing almost. Making sure that the men are very masculine. And I mean, the models were straight, so I think for the most part they were straight, so I don't know. Anyway, so let's see. So let's get into a little bit of the mess. So they, like I said, they had a few people there that had they had their name, and then it would say former employee, and I was like, and these were for the most part people of color. And so I was like, this is interesting, because I thought that they didn't hire people of color. I didn't think that they hired people who weren't white people. And so they went through their like marketing strategy and all of the aesthetic stuff, and them kind of going into their peak and all that kind of stuff. And then I think that the first scandal that they started with was them using like racial slurs, not slurs, but like racial stereotypes on graphic tees. And the one specific one that they pointed out was in 2002, they had a graphic tee that said two Wongs, like I'm assuming a play on Chinese names. Two Wongs can make a can make a white. And it was a graphic tee in the style of like, I think that the font was in the style of like the same font you would see on maybe like a sriracha bottle or something like that. And then I think it was supposed to be like an advertisement for like a laundromat or something like that. And they had a whole line of teas that had these like racial, like racism jokes, I guess, on them. Now, one thing that I will say about this that was glaringly obvious to me, and I think I feel like I mentioned this before, the early 2000s was a cursed time. It was cursed. It's weird that we have such nostalgia for the early 2000s because I feel like everybody was very brainwashed in the early 2000s. Here's what I mean by that. Is in the early 2000s there was this weird pocket of time. I don't know what. There were a lot of forces that came together to create the early 2000s and the sentiment around the early 2000s. We were in this period of time where people believed we were in a post-racial America. There was a lot of propaganda kind of hopping off of 9/11, where we were like all Americans. We were joined in our Americanness or whatever. But not only that, what I will say as somebody, like I've mentioned at the beginning of this, I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood. I grew up around black folks. So as somebody who was not in white America throughout that time, what I will say as an observer is that there was this weird thing of the early 2000s was this weird period where almost white people were given free reign within fashion and culture and all kinds of different things to just be terrible, to just be awful. And we were just like, okay, that's the way that the world is. Like, that's the way that we interact with each other. That's how things are. And it's like, well, no. So there was a lot of bigotry. There was a lot of homophobia. There was a lot of transphobia. There was a lot of fat phobia, a lot of terrible opinions around HIV/AIDS and those kinds of things, swirling around in that time. And so, am I surprised that they came out with a racist t-shirt in 2002? No. And I think that far too often people look at time periods like that and then look at now and see it more so as like that was a better time and now we're too critical, when in reality I'm trying to push this agenda. I need y'all to understand. The early 2000s was cursed, y'all. It was not a good time. It was not a good time for anybody outside of white people, to be perfectly honest with you. There's a lot of really bad fashion in that time. The Bermuda shorts and the bracelets and the wearing vests over everything and belts, and it was a bad time. You know what I'm saying? And honestly, I feel like that's a lot of the reason why a brand like an Abercrombie and Fitch was doing so well then, is because they were selling that kind of like white American aesthetic, which that was how they were described throughout this entire documentary also, is that they were all American. And I always am kind of like, you know what I'm saying, what does that mean, all American? Because you know what I'm saying, like as a black person who's from America, I can tell you that all American usually just means white, 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 even though that's not representative of America at all. But the 2000s, the early 2000s was this very specific time where, how can I explain it? It's like the early 2000s was a very small period of time where there was a small period of time where black people even and this is probably true throughout all groups of marginalized communities, desired that aesthetic, even though it was unattainable, desired to be part of that white all American aesthetic. Like, that's why it was so profitable to sell that at that time. You could not get away with that now, right? You couldn't get away with an Abercrombie and Fitch aesthetic, that aesthetic that they had in the early 2000s. Now you couldn't get away. Like, we'd be like, why is it so incredibly white? Like, what is happening? Why are they so skinny? You know what I'm saying? Like, um and I think it says less about the brand and more about the time period to me. I just wanted to make a note of that. So they were selling these racist graphic tees. um the Mike Jefferies, who I mentioned before, who was the CEO of the company, um was I applaud being, I think when you're a creative and you're doing art direction and those kinds of things, it's next to impossible to not be a micromanager, especially when you start to get more and more people involved. It's like, I have to know what's going on with everything. I get it. But he took it a step too far, right? Um they were describing this thing called, like, they were calling them corporate blitzes, where, like, I don't know if it was specifically Mike Jefferies himself, or if it was I don't know if it was specifically Mike Jefferies himself, or if it was just like upper management would come to visit the store, and they would not only look at how the store is set up and whether or not it's clean and if the displays look nice and those kinds of things, but also judge the staff, and then do this passive aggressive thing where they would leave after the blitz and basically tell them who to fire, like, this person's not attractive enough, or move them to the back. Like, that was the thing that they were doing, was taking people that they deemed to be unattractive, usually people of color, and putting them in the stock room in the back so that they weren't the face of the company. um and so that's where a lot of this, like, racist stuff was coming in. I didn't know that it was that blatant. Like, when we were discussing it when I was in college, I didn't know that they meant, like, literally they would fire people. Well, they didn't fire people. They just didn't schedule their black employees. They didn't schedule their brown employees. You know what I'm saying? I didn't know it was that blatant. That they were I didn't know that they literally were putting them in the back of the store. I didn't know that it was that blatant. That's a totally different level of discrimination, in my opinion. Um, there was let's see, there was a woman named Jennifer Sheehan, I think is how you pronounce it, and she used to be a former store employee. She's Asian, and she worked at a store that was near UC Irvine here in California. And UC Irvine is predominantly Asian, and so it made sense that, I mean, their corporate policy was that they would take and they would have hiring managers, or recruiters, go out into the community and pick people from the community to work at the store, to be the face of the store. So it makes sense that at UC Irvine, you're going to have people who are Asian. You're going to have people who are Asian working in the store, right? And evidently, what Jennifer was saying in her interview was that, I don't know if it was specifically that Mike Jefferies came to the store. I'm gonna have to go back and double check. I don't know if it was Mike Jefferies that specifically came to the store, but there was a corporate blitz, and management came and saw who was working at the store. And basically, I didn't quite get it, how they let all of their Asian employees go. But Jennifer was not the only one. She mentioned that, like, she was one of several people who were let go shortly after that happened. And that when she questioned further as to why everybody was let go, and you know what I'm saying, those kinds of things, she said that they were looking for a more Eurocentric aesthetic to match I think that what she specifically said was that they need somebody, whoever the manager was that came to visit the store, pointed to the pictures that they had posted all over the store and said that that's what we need our employees to look like, even though they're near UC Irvine and the people who live around UC Irvine don't look like that. So, I mean, just dumb. There was another person named Dr. Anthony Ocampo, who was also a store employee, and similar story. I think he stopped getting scheduled, or he wasn't getting scheduled as much as he wanted to, and so he goes in and asks for more hours, or I don't know if it was like seasonal or something. He was trying to get his job back. I recall that's what he was saying. Is he was trying to either get more hours or get his job back, like he'd worked there before, and was told point blank that they already had a Filipino person working there, and that they didn't need another one. And he made a point of saying, "I never mentioned what my ethnic background was." You know how insane that is. Um, And lastly, there was a black woman named Carla Barrientos. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. Um, and she mentioned she was a black woman who worked for the store. She was a store employee, and multiple times throughout the entire like documentary, she mentioned like her mom was like in the background, like, I don't know why you like this store so much. I don't know why you want to work there so badly. Like, I don't understand what it is about this brand that you like so much. Just kind of like telling her in I'm assuming the softest way possible, like, don't go there, girl. But she decided to work there anyway, and she described her experience of, I don't know if there was a corporate, there probably was a corporate blitz involved with her situation as well. And her hours got changed to like a night shift or whatever. She was no longer working a day shift, and they were like putting her in the back and those kinds of things. And she was asking like, well, can I get more hours? Can I work? Like, why are you putting me in the back? Those kinds of things. And instead of letting her go, they just stopped scheduling her. And she said, like, they never actually fired me. They never actually let me go. They just stopped scheduling. I was just never on the schedule. And it was like, she said she hadn't been on the schedule for like 2 months, 2 whole months of not being on the schedule. And she asked her friend who was also working there. And her friend just said point blank, like, I think they're not scheduling you because you're black. And she was like, well, I'm the only black person that works at the store, so maybe you're right. And she said that wasn't so much of an epiphany as she just like was like, yeah. And then she went and told her mom about this situation, and her mom was like, I don't know why you ever wanted to. I could tell. And I feel like, you know what I'm saying? I feel like a lot of people, that I think that's the two perspectives that I'm trying to like harp on here, is that there's some people kind of like myself who like immediately got that vibe from that company of like, this is not for us. This is not intended for us. I don't see us anywhere in this. And then there's other people who maybe succumb to the peer pressure. I would have to imagine largely because they went to like a predominantly white high school, succumb to the peer pressure of like, well, this is the brand that people say is cool. This is the brand that I should work for, right? Like, I should be associated with this brand. And then through no fault of their own, through outside of their control, just through, I mean, discriminatory practices, you know what I'm saying, being removed from the schedule and not even being able to work there. And so there was this segment within the documentary where all of these people of color that I was like, well, why, you know what I'm saying, how did they get all these people of color? Like, they don't even hire people of color. Slowly but surely, they're revealing that all of these people were disheartened by the treatment that they had received working for the company, and then ultimately they ended up filing a lawsuit against the company for discrimination. And so, and one thing that I thought was really notable about them filing a lawsuit against Abercrombie and Fitch is that the lawyer who was head of the class action lawsuit was actively looking. He put out, I think, listings looking for plaintiffs, looking for people to be part of this class action lawsuit, and was having trouble finding enough people to be part of this class action lawsuit because they already were so discriminatory with their hiring practices that there were so few people of color that worked for the company in the first place that they couldn't compile enough people to do this class action lawsuit initially. Like, it took time for them to find enough people to do this class action lawsuit. That's how few people of color they were hiring in the first place, and then discriminating against the handful that were there. So imagine that on a large scale. Like, you're hiring what, like 2%, 3%, 5%? I don't know the numbers, but like an insanely small percentage of people of color. And then instead of, I mean, to maybe just to save face, I don't know what was the point of going through that in the first? You can't, I guess they didn't want people to think that they were being discriminatory in their hiring, so they would hire people of color, kind of. But then just turn around and not schedule them or like put them in the bag. They had pictures in this documentary of people of color, black people, brown people, working in the stock room. You know what I'm saying? Like deliberately put them back there. It was crazy. I mean, what the hell? So, with this lawsuit, they ended up settling out of court. It was a $50 million settlement, and they had a consent decree. They entered into a consent decree, and they hired a black man named Todd Corley to be a chief diversity officer in their company. I think they hired an entire team, but he was head of the team. And so they started doing a little bit better, kind of. They started including, but by that point, a lot of the damage had already been done. They started putting more people of color, like black people, Asian people, in their like advertisements and things like that. They started running ads like, you know, we're all Abercrombie and Fitch. We all belong to this brand is for everybody. Those kinds of things. And before I get too far down that road, there was an activist named Benjamin O'Keefe so there was this article to my point of the early 2000s being a cursed time. I'm telling y'all, it was cursed. Stop thinking that was a magical time. It was cursed. So there was evidently an article. Salon magazine interviewed Mike Jefferies, the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch, in 2006. And there's this article where he's discussing, like, they're asking him what's making the brand so cool and those kinds of things. Like, this is back in 2006. They're asking him what's up with the brand aesthetic, those kinds of things, right? And so in this interview, I pulled a paragraph, the one that they reference in the actual documentary itself. But I would advise that you go read the entire article because it's still up. But in this one paragraph, the one that they referenced, it says, as far as Jeffries is concerned, America's unattractive, overweight, or otherwise undesirable teens can shop elsewhere. Quote, in every school, there are cool and popular kids, and then there are the not so cool kids, he says. Candidly, we go after the cool kids. We go after the attractive, all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. A lot of people don't belong in our clothes, and they can't belong. Are we exclusionary? Absolutely. Those companies that are in trouble are trying to target everybody, young, old, fat, skinny. But then you become totally vanilla. You don't alienate anybody, but you don't excite anybody. You don't incite anybody either. And this is Mike Jefferies saying this, the CEO. Lord. So this largely went unnoticed. Again, because the early 2000s was cursed. I'm telling y'all. That was the way that things were back then. I feel like we take for granted how many strides we've made in terms of representation over the past, even just the past like 6-7 years ish. That was the way that like we just kind of ate that back then, right? Like it was true. Like brands were selling us white, skinny, blonde hair, blue-eyed. You know what I'm saying? That was what was like, and they didn't even have to apologize for it. We just knew that was the way the fashion was, right? Back then, we just accepted that was the way the fashion was. And so nobody made a big deal about this when it initially came out. It was just like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's how the brand is, right? It's exclusionary. Now it sounds terrible, right? But back then it was like that's the way that people talked back then. That's the way that brands set themselves up back then. And so there's a activist slash public speaker named Benjamin O'Keefe who came across this exact same article years later in 2013 and read it. And this man is black, gay, and plus size. And so he was saying, like, I've never, you know what I'm saying, Abercrombie and Fitch has never been a brand that has targeted me in any way, shape, or form. It's never catered to me. I can't wear their clothes, not only because they're too expensive, but because they don't have plus sizes and those kinds of things. And so, but he read this article, and I mean, we can all understand why it lit a fire under him, right? He said he read this and was like, this is awful. And it was. So he put together a petition to get Abercrombie and Fitch first to apologize for these viewpoints and then to carry plus sizes. And that's what led into them eventually being, I don't know if this was before or after the class action lawsuit. I have to look it up. But all of this started to happen in about, probably like this was happening in 2013. I don't know specifically when they started doing all of their more diversity and inclusion stuff. I don't know when that started. But because of the consent decree, they were forced to, you know what I'm saying, like relinquish numbers and those kinds of things of like who they were hiring, where they were within the company, those kinds of things. And one thing that I think was interesting about the fact that they went under this consent decree and started trying to market to people of color a little bit more and started trying to hire a little bit more or more people of color. At that point, I really feel like the damage was kind of already done. I don't hear anybody talking about Abercrombie and Fitch anymore, to be perfectly honest. I've not been to a mall, so I'd have to imagine that is a huge part of it as well. That people just don't go to malls anymore. I'd have to imagine that the fast fashion vibe that's been going on for the past like decade or so probably has taken a huge toll. I don't recall shopping at Abercrombie and Fitch, but I definitely remember shopping at Forever 21 and H&M. And I have to imagine that they took a huge part of their market, like had to have taken a huge chunk of their clientele. And this exclusionary attitude doesn't really fly anymore. So, but what was interesting is that the consent decree ended. The chief diversity officer, they were interviewing him. He no longer works there. And they just kind of like went back to being like there was pushback to all of the diversity and inclusion practices that they had implemented immediately after that consent decree ended. And I think that just says what kind of a company they are. I think that there's a fine line from what I've taken away from this, because I love aesthetic. I think that that's the unfortunate part of being a black artist or black designer is that you constantly have to wrestle with having a love of art and creation and expression and recognize that it's sometimes directly against you. Like, it's like, oh, this is beautiful, but this is very clearly for white people. That kind of a thing. Like, that is like the constant state of black creators and designers. And so, I think that when you're in that position, you kind of have to take the perspective of like, what can I learn from this and what should I throw away? Like, what should I take away from this and what should I throw away as like nonsense? And so for me, I was like, I still have great admiration for being that committed to aesthetic. Like putting shutters on the outside of your store, having this perfume that you can smell when you're outside of it, you know what I'm saying? Having music that you can hear from the other side of the mall sometimes, you know what I'm saying? Being very precise about the lighting and those kinds of things. I would argue maybe just a tad bit more energy in the actual clothes themselves. But imagine if any of that energy and focus, and not only that, but like even with like the art directors specifically having that vision of like masculinity and those kinds of things. Imagine if that exact same attention to detail and that exact same vision was more inclusive, right? Like if it was like you don't have to be exclusionary to be true to your aesthetic. You can, you know what I'm saying? Imagine that exact same aesthetic if it was including black and brown people, right? If it was including black people and Asian people and Latina people, like imagine if they had started there. I feel like the brand would be in a totally different place now. And we've seen that happen to a few different brands that were really popping off in the early 2000s because again, the early 2000s was a cursed period of time. Look at Victoria's Secret. How they doing over there at Victoria's Secret? Not very well. Because they only like skinny people, right? With small, hey man, right? And that's with small boobs. Like they were exclusionary and it did them in. Abercrombie and Fitch was exclusionary and it did them in. I believe that we were almost in a daze. We were not fully aware of things, how they were in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. We were in this collective haze of like, white people are setting this aesthetic and we should just aim for it. And I think that since then we've decided like, well, that's not the aesthetic, right? Like I can be the aesthetic. Anybody can be the aesthetic, right? Like you should aim for, I mean, by all means, be very specific about the aesthetic of your brand, but being specific about the way that the people who wear your brand look is where you start to get into some problems. The only other thing that I wanted to talk about was that Bruce Weber situation. I feel like that needs to we need to discuss Bruce Weber. So Bruce Weber, which brings up a whole nother conversation really. Bruce Weber, again, is the photographer behind the brand. He's the one who set the aesthetic photography-wise. He's the one who took the photos that were on the bags, on the walls, those kinds of things. And admittedly, great photography, right? I don't think that it was all that groundbreaking just because, you know, white chiseled men, you know what I'm saying, a lot of the work is already done there, right? And then just putting things in black and white is like, but Bruce Weber was sexually harassing people, allegedly. Bruce Weber is a gay man. Like I said, a lot of the people who were in charge of the art direction and advertising and marketing, that kind of stuff for the brand were gay men, gay white men. Bruce Weber was known for a book called something Bear. Hold on one second. Wait for it. Bear Pond. There we go. He published a photography book called Bear Pond in 1990. And supposedly that was, first and foremost, that is a book that a lot of white gay men in the 90s loved. They said that they all owned it. I've never heard of it. I've never seen it. I am a black gay woman, so way outside of so I'll take their word for it that it was an amazing book. But supposedly that book is what, I don't know if Mike Jefferies specifically saw it and said that's what I want for the brand, but he evidently was familiar with Bruce Weber and his work, and that's what he decided. Very specifically, you're in charge of the photography for the brand, which I can't fault. That was a great marketing campaign, especially for the women's and I mean maybe there's something to learn there about, like, if you get women and gay men on board, straight men will eventually get there, maybe. But Bruce Weber was like, I think that this is a prevalent thing for photographers in general. You got to be careful with photographers. You know what I'm saying? I think that as somebody who's a visual artist but does not rely on subjects necessarily, or going to find subjects to come and model for me necessarily. Like, I've done life drawing, but that's not like my art form exclusively. It's crazy to me that people use that to be predatory, but people use a lot of things to be predatory. And that's the thing with photography, is that there are a lot of people out here who are like, I'm a photographer, I'm an artist, those kinds of things. Take your clothes off so I can take pictures of you. Or, you know what I'm saying? Or you gotta, you know, in order to, like, if they already have like a name for themselves, there's a prevalence now of photographers trying to trade photo shoots for like sexual favors, or sexual harassment is rampant within the photography community. People taking advantage of people under the guise of art is rampant within the photography community. Now, do I believe that there is such a thing as tasteful nudes? Absolutely. As somebody who went to art school, I'm like heavily desensitized to nudity. We saw naked people every single day. So, I mean, you know what I'm saying, do I believe that nudity can be tasteful? Yes. But do I think that that is an easy road for people to get a little weird and be a little predatory? Absolutely. I do. And that's evidently what Bruce Weber did, allegedly. There were models coming forward, male models coming forward and saying that he was doing weird. Listen, bruh, like, he would, like, I don't know if he was specifically feeling on them. There was one model who was saying that he put his hand on the model's hand and then put the model's hand on his own body and was going to start going down or whatever. And he said, tell me to stop when it gets uncomfortable. Like, weird, nope, like that. You know what I'm saying? And obviously the model who was discussing this said that he stopped the hand at his chest and was like, you ain't going no further, which, good for him. But I think that there are a lot of people who take advantage of situations like that. If you're a young man, and there's prestige around the brand Abercrombie and Fitch, and the lead photographer, for Abercrombie and Fitch has had you flown out to, they were doing shoots in like Brazil and things like that. You've been flown out. From what I understand, it was a very loose style that they were doing, that they just kind of had people running around doing stuff, and he would just kind of snap pictures of things that he thought were interesting as they were doing things. And so that kind of sets up an environment where people are vying for attention in the first place. And so there's a power imbalance there, obviously. If you're a young man and you've been chosen for this, there's an opportunity there for you to be the face of this brand that has yet to fall and be a little problematic. There's an opportunity there for you to be the face of Abercrombie and Fitch, to have girls, you know what I'm saying, putting your picture on their lockers or in their rooms or those kinds of things. Or to have men idolizing you as an Abercrombie and Fitch dude. So, I don't know. It was rife with predatory behavior. And I'm not surprised, to be perfectly honest, with the way that they said the company was set up and the way that they managed the company. I'm not surprised. When you give one person that much power within a singular company, like, he was the photographer. Like, I'm sure he had assistants and things like that, but like, he was the photographer for Abercrombie and Fitch. So, the amount of power that one man had, you have to oversee that, right? Like, you have to manage that. You can't just say like, well, he's an artist, he does what he does. You know what I'm saying? There's a greater conversation there probably about like, is the art greater than the artist? We have this conversation periodically as a community. Is the art greater than the artist? Do we overlook this? And I feel like a lot of people overlook stuff like this when it happens to men too. Like, if the subject of sexual harassment is a man, then there's no way that he could, you know what I'm saying, he couldn't be a victim because he's a man. Which is false. You know what I'm saying? They sounded very uncomfortable with the behavior that this man displayed towards them. And so I don't know. You need to be able to say, even if you love his aesthetic, even if you love the photos that he's producing, you need to be able to say, the safety of these models is more important, and the brand and its image and the way that we make people feel with our brand is more important than working with this specific photographer. Because like I said again, like, it's not, I think that when you have white gay men as your art directors and your marketing department, that they're going to overplay the significance of some of this. It might be a little bit controversial. Sorry if I'm, you know what I'm saying, against your icon or whatever. But to me, it's like, okay, there's already an aesthetic around fit men, specifically white fit men, like men who are already like chiseled and that kind of thing. People already flock towards that aesthetic. People already prize that aesthetic. So half the work is already done with the photo, just because the man in it is already attractive by Eurocentric standards. You know what I'm saying? Like by modern day standards, right? Half the work is already done. Then you start adding in things like nudity. Okay, so now that's adding visual emphasis or interest, because I mean, it's nudity that people look at nude photos. They just do. So how much of the work is left? And then you put things in black and white. I have opinions about black and white. I think that black and white is an easy way to make photos more interesting, kind of. I don't think that it's all that great of a choice all the time. So it depends. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. I just don't think that this man's work was that groundbreaking. I don't think that any man's work is all that groundbreaking that it needs to overshadow the fact that he is harassing people. Right? I don't think that any man's work is that great that it should overshadow the fact that he's harming people. So that was the only other thing that I wanted to say. This was interesting to watch. I think that I'm still going to take my notes on branding, because I think that there's something there that's significant about branding. But everything else is trash. The way that they treated people, the brand, I think aesthetic wise, the brand was fine. I think that people wise, it was just terrible, just awful. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. If you made it this far through the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you liked the video, could you give it a thumbs up? And if you could subscribe to the channel, I would really appreciate that. Share the video, those kinds of things. Comment under the video. Let me know your thoughts. And until I see you next time, be good.